Trauma is not what happens to us, but it is actually our response. It's an emotional, a physical, it can be a biological, a spiritual response to what happens. Okay. And that's what can make it trauma. So we can have trauma. So some of the core traumatic reactions that happen are number one, hyperarousal. So we're going to cover some basics here. Hyperarousal, and that is where there is a hypervigilance, right? That's where our body, our mind, everything is on alert and on alarm, waiting for something to happen, waiting for that next switch. That's the hyperarousal. Constriction is a lot of times what, you feel like really tight and or say you in a car accident or something like that, or just you feel like somebody's going to hit you, constrict. The blood vessels constrict, the heart, all of the body, the posture. That's the constriction that can happen with trauma. And so that's another core thing that happens. So there's hyperarousal, there's constriction, and hyperarousal. Also, all of the systems like the blood pressure goes up, right? Heart rate increases. So the autonomic system, it goes on alert. The next thing that happens is disassociation. And this is where, I think if you can, so dissociation is another thing that happens. This is the third thing. And this is really where the thing to remember is that our body and our mind, the way God designed us, is to adapt, but also to protect us. And we talked about last time about how the brain, of certain parts of the brain, the amygdala, wants to keep us alive. So survival is an important thing. And so we're going to talk about some of that tonight as well. There's some really fascinating things so disassociation though is when something is overwhelming. Maybe it's too overwhelming for the mind, it's too overwhelming for the body. And so there's a part of us that disassociates, and that's disconnects, detaches from the reality, detaches from what's going on. And that's the disassociation. Now that can also become a pattern. If there's been a lot of trauma, that can become a pattern or a habit of disassociating or living disassociated. So disassociation is the next one. And the last one is the freezing or immobility. And that's associated with the feeling of helplessness. And that's just, I don't know what to do. And that's the central nervous system just shuts down, freeze. We'll show an example of that. So those are some of the core. Now there's some of the bigger symptoms also of trauma. And as we go through these, you could just be checking and seeing, hey, do any of those apply? First, a lot of times when people have experienced trauma, there's low self-esteem, shame, guilt, and a lot of self-blame a lot of times. Difficulty sleeping, anxiety. There's also vulnerability. There's a lot of times loss of intimacy, shame, guilt, self-blame, anger, disassociation. Talked about that, numbness, difficulty sleeping, flashbacks. So these are these are responses to trauma. Trauma is a response. So these are responses to something that may have happened that we don't know how to process. Okay, that the body doesn't know how to process. Some of these are repeats, intrusive imagery, flashbacks, a lot of times veterans, or not even just veterans, people. And I'm going to explain why the system does this a little bit as well, why there's flashbacks and imagery that happens sometimes. Extreme sensitivity to light and sound, hyperactivity, exaggerated emotional and startle responses. There can be nightmares and night terrors, and usually that's about it. So again, abrupt mood swings, reduced ability to deal with stress, and a hard time sleeping. It can be panic attacks, anxiety, spaciness, exaggerated startled response, and some of the same ones. So these are, if you notice, a lot of these, amnesia, forgetfulness, inability to love or nurture or bond with others.